Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. Earlier this year, the World Economic Forum released its Global Risks Report, listing disinformation as the biggest global risk in the short term, while the Eurasia Group, a political risk consultancy headed by American political scientist Ian Bremmer and former Principal Secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Gerald Butts, listed disinformation as a key factor in 3 of its top 5 global risks. So how is disinformation putting global stability at risk, and how is Canada affected? Here to discuss is one of my favorite follows on TikTok, an award-winning journalist and investigative reporter, Rachel Gilmore. Rachel, hello.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Oh, of course. Thanks so much for being here. Now, the terms misinformation and disinformation are often used together or sometimes even interchangeably. But what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
The biggest difference there is, so disinformation, this is how I kind of remember the difference in my head. It's kind of like a grammatical trick or something. Disinformation is deliberate. Misinformation can be mistaken. So if I'm spreading a falsehood or conspiracy, but I genuinely believe it's true, that would likely be misinformation. Whereas disinformation is more of a deliberate effort. It's when I know I'm saying a falsehood. And so this is more of the kind of thing you'll get grifters who are trying to profit off of fear, or actors who are knowingly spreading propaganda, things like that.
Now, why is disinformation a global threat?
Oh my God. I mean, especially this year, it's huge because it totally affects your ability to adequately, fully, and I guess, responsibly, or to the full, you need to be able to have all of the facts at your disposal to make a fair, informed choice about who you want to elect. And this year, there are more elections taking place around the world than in a very long time. I think it's something like 61 different elections. I might have that figure slightly wrong, but there's a lot of them this year specifically. People are calling it the year of elections. So there's a lot of damage that can be done this year if people trade on through disinformation or misinformation, not only in the sense that they might not actually elect the person who they would choose to support if they had the full facts at their disposal, but also because they might not trust the results of elections themselves, which is an extremely destabilizing factor. If people no longer have trust in our institutions, I mean, we all saw what happened on January 6th and the taste.
Right. So then how is disinformation a threat to Canada specifically? I mean, I don't think we've had the same type of election doubts that our neighbors to the south have had.
We haven't yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see some of that. I mean, every time I think, oh, we won't go there, at least we're not doing this, I give it like 2 end up doing it too. So I'm unfortunately not super real in that respect. But I mean, we're seeing conspiratorial rhetoric take hold. I mean, that's kind of the wave that pushed the Freedom Convoy to Ottawa. And that was extremely disruptive. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of that sort of gathering. Well, I mean, actually, we are already seeing that kind of continuing to take place based on conspiratorial rhetoric. We've seen gather around Justin Trudeau whenever he has, and they get wind that he's in, and they're carrying flags like U.S. flags, Trump flags, and their grievances are just massive, but not actually tied to reality. There are plenty of real reasons serious with Trudeau or any other political leader. But what's distinct here is that they're sort of fueled by conspiracies that you encounter in dark corners of the internet that have kind of increasingly ballooned into a mainstream. So those can really affect people's democratic participation, because if your concerns are being so polluted by falsehoods, it kind of deprives you of the time and energy and capacity to look into the things that actually genuinely impact your life and participate fully in that democratic process. And then there's the whole issue of it not actually, the result of that democratic process not being trusted. So
right. I feel like part of the issue also is, you know, it's fine to have agreements, but if you're working on the same set of facts, at least you're in the same realm of reality. But if people are working off different quote unquote facts, you know, how do you even come to any sort of compromise or agreement or consensus, right?
No, exactly. I mean, that was actually a really interesting experience I had when I started speaking to one of these sort of anti-vaccine, anti-mandate, but primarily conspiratorially driven protesters in front of Parliament. It wasn't during the convoy. It was, I think, the Canada Day iteration or another one of the demonstrations that were kind of tied to that whole freedom movement. And I tried to just fact check what the guy was saying to me. But it's this whole idea of having alternative facts. I mean, if someone genuinely doesn't operate on the same plane of reality to you, how can you fact check them? Everything you say is sort of fruit of the poison tree in their mind. And it makes it difficult to have any sort of debate about the substance of the issues or the best way to handle an issue if you can't even agree on the issue itself.
Now, at its core, I feel like we've always had disinformation, right? Whether it's political spin or corporate messaging or moral panics like the Salem witch trials to just straight up propaganda. So why is disinformation so much of a threat now? I mean, aside from the fact that there's elections happening all over the world.
Social media, I'd say, is the huge thing here. I mean, it's just supercharged our ability to disseminate disinformation. It's also created somewhat of a profit motive for disinformation. I mean, through the ad tech industry, especially where there's very little oversight and very little regulation, you see people who are able to profit off of getting the kinds of clicks and attention that you get from spreading disinformation, because often things that aren't true are also going to be the same things that elicit a really strong emotional reaction. That's one thing fact checkers always tell you is if you see something that makes you feel really angry or really upset, take a beat and breathe and fact check it, because disinformation often is supposed to elicit that kind of reaction. And that makes sense when you consider the fact that that is what social media algorithms reward. So we're kind of living in this era where there's not only the ability, but the monetization and the motivation to engage in disinformation is bigger than ever. And that just creates the kind of chaotic, soup of lies that we see all over the internet these days. It's just like a minefield, and you have to try not to step on one.
So really quickly, as you just said, I believe this too, that social media is supercharging disinformation. Overall, was social media just a bad idea for us?
I don't think so. I love social media because I think that what's great about social media is it also democratizes the dissemination of information. So we're seeing people able to share stories about their communities and also just connect with loved ones who are on the other side of the world. There's so many upsides to social media used responsibly and properly. It's just unfortunate that the same tools that give us so much power to inform and converse and build movements and, protests and change and all of that good stuff also comes with this horrific, toxic underbelly.
We are now in the podcast extension part of my chat with Rachel Gilmore. Rachel, I'm a big fan. Thank you so much for sticking around.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
When we talk about misinformation and disinformation here in Canada, is the call coming from inside the house, or is it foreign actors like Russia and China or Iran or North Korea that are actually disseminating this disinformation and sowing division amongst Canadians?
We give the foreign actors way too much credit for things that we are extremely capable of doing ourselves, actually. One thing that I found really fascinating, I went to a conference like a year ago where there were a lot of disinformation and extremism experts speaking. And one of the things, I believe it was Stephanie Carvin, who's a political science expert and prof at Carleton, she was discussing the fact that Russian disinformation efforts don't actually have to seed that much in terms of new ideas. They just take the divisions that are already happening within our information environment and just dial it up a notch. So they can take advantage of the ways that we're already fighting with each other, the ways we're already making stuff up. I'm trying to not swear as much as I normally do. So that they can take advantage of that and just use that to their benefit, because we're already fighting each other. We're already spreading this mis and disinformation. And one thing that is fascinating to me is that if you actually look at a lot of the biggest, sort of right-wing disinfo grifter sphere people in the States, a lot of them are actually Canadian who go down there.
Yeah.
So that's always been something that stood out to me.
Now, regardless of the source, what is it that makes Canadians, or I guess anyone, so vulnerable to disinformation?
I think it's a variety of factors. A sort of pet theory that I think is also borne out by some of the research is the fact that people want answers, simple answers to big, scary things. Right. So disinformation often offers a villain or that sort of archetypal mythic narrative where there's a clear evil and a clear good. And if you do this, this, and this, and oppose this, this, and this, you're going to be on the right side, on the righteous side, on the side of good. And when, it's a very kind of simplistic way of viewing the world that allows you to avoid the sort of existential anxiety that is elicited when you think about, climate change or the ways in which capitalism has exacerbated wealth inequality to a point that is difficult for many people to endure. But instead of looking at the really complex, nuanced solutions to those problems, if you have a boogeyman like the WEF and Klaus Schwab, for example, maybe I'm showing my brainworms a bit too much right now, you can actually kind of latch onto that and feel like a sense of control. So I think a lot of it is about finding control in situations where there isn't much, which is why COVID was such a huge breeding ground for conspiracism, because it was so out of our control and so scary. I mean, is it Mother Nature, just doing her thing and coming up with the ability to kill us, which she could do at any time, or is it all a big conspiracy and a bioweapon by a specific bad actor that you can point as the villain? Nature's a lot scarier than a specific bad guy. So it's having easy answers. It's what it's all about.
Is part of the problem that, for better or worse, we all used to rely on the same source material? Like, everyone was kind of limited in terms of what you could watch on TV, what news you could consume. So now the culture of entertainment, news, politics even, is very atomized. And we're all susceptible to falling into echo chambers that just confirm our own bias, no matter how detached from reality. And even more than that, differences of opinion were discussed on the same set of facts and information, as we touched on earlier. But now, how do you even have a dialogue with someone who believes the earth is flat?
And that's sort of the heart of the right. And there's a lot of people who are way smarter than me who spend a lot of time studying how to bring people back from the brink. People who really have fallen into these rabbit holes. And a lot of what I've read is that there's a huge amount of value in prevention, just pre-bunking misinformation or common conspiracies by getting the actual factual dissection of a falsehood they might encounter out there, so that when people encounter that falsehood, they already know, oh, this is false because I know this, and this. But it does make it really hard to have a conversation with people. And I think that is such an isolating thing. I mean, a lot of these rabbit holes that people go down are in part because they cut off so many of their loved ones because they believe a conspiracy. You hear these really sad stories about people whose loved ones have gone down the QAnon rabbit hole, or people who became anti-vaccine during the pandemic. And that might have initially just been a bit of fear about the vaccine that could have maybe been countered if they had fallen on the right sources, but they fell on the wrong ones. And then their family went, I don't want you around me because you could be more likely to spread this virus, which is, fair on the family's part. But then that person becomes more isolated and seeks out other like-minded people who are also isolated, and they cling to that community, even if that community starts to descend more and more into a more and more conspiratorial place. It's like the fundamental kind of human desire for connection and being around people who make you feel loved and seen and heard. And I think that that's where a lot of people actually end up becoming quite radicalized in their conspiracism or fall really deep down rabbit holes is where they have a certain loneliness, and it can get really dark really fast. And that's why I get really angry at some of these grifters that send people down these rabbit holes, because they're taking advantage of people. It's like someone who's the head of a pyramid scheme or an MLM or whatever, who's like, hey, you can become a millionaire overnight if you just take my course or whatever. That's the same kind of vibe with these grifter conspiracists. And they're taking lonely people or people who feel like they are super depressed or having other mental health issues and have a desire for answers, and they say they're giving them to them. And it's just really messed up.
I mean, it's interesting. You're talking about these disinformation grifters and MLM schemes, and you have Andrew Tate basically doing both of those things simultaneously.
I know,
right?
yeah.
I mean, the descent that you're describing of the person that falls into it, I mean, that's the same journey that someone takes when they get into a cult. It starts with something small or some sort of skepticism, and it slowly ratchets up, right? Like, it's not like they're sold on the big thing right away. It is kind of a process that someone goes through.
Oh, absolutely. I remember this was a story I always pitched at Global, and I never had time to really dig into it, was I wanted to dig into sort of the cult of conspiracism, and I wanted to speak to experts in cults, like people who really understand how cults function, about, the degree to which these conspiracy communities are cults. It's funny. There's a lot of different, I read this book by Amanda Montell called Cultish, and there's a lot of different, there's a lot of disagreement about what is and isn't a cult. And it's fascinating, actually, when you go into the debates. But I really do think that there's so much overlap there between what could be considered a cult and what these people are falling prey to.
Right. Now, speaking of cults, let's talk about political parties for a second. I believe that even if politicians aren't disseminating disinformation directly, they're not quick to call it out if it's benefiting them. And in fact, I think some will leverage disinformation to their political advantage. Here in Canada, what role do you think our leaders have in tacitly consenting to the spread of disinformation?
Oh, it's massive. I mean, I think you made a really good point about, I think every single political leader is guilty of not correcting the record when the record is beneficial for them. Don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake or something, But I will say that there is one party that is actively spreading disinformation to a degree that is not taking place in other parties, unless you count the PPC, which is kind of a non-factor at this point, even though that would probably make Maxime Bernier shake his fist at me. But it's the Conservatives. I mean, Pierre Poilievre is explicitly using like dog whistles for, I just did a TikTok on this because Alex Jones is saying that Pierre Poilievre is saying the same things as him. And he's using
what a great endorsement. What an awesome endorsement.
It's wild. And, Poilievre could deal with that in a heartbeat by just saying, I do not accept the endorsement of this man,
right,
which should be quite easy to say. But the difficulty is when you have appealed to people who believe the same things that Alex Jones is saying, and increasingly the things that Pierre Poilievre is saying, how do you walk that back? How do you then turn around and condemn or disavow someone who is saying the things that you've been trying to appeal to the adherence of for so long? I mean, it's really problematic, and it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube once you decide that legitimizing conspiratorial rhetoric is a part of your political strategy, because that's you're grabbing hold of a very powerful thing that is very hard to control.
And I think what you're describing then gives a lot of power to the quote unquote fringes, right? Because even though they may not be represented by the mass population, they will have tacit consent from larger leaders who don't want to lose their support.
Well, and that's something that you see. I mean, we were chatting about this a little bit before the show. The fringes feel emboldened when they see their rhetoric parroted by the more mainstream. They think that they're having a degree of control because they see that that mainstream actor wants to appeal to this fringe. And so they feel as though they can kind of shift that Overton window, which, if people aren't familiar with the concept, it's sort of like this idea that there's a window of what's acceptable in political discourse or public discourse, things that you can say without being immediately like smacked down. And so like these guys on the fringes are constantly trying to move that window of acceptability. And that's like, I mean, we saw the members of the far right group Diagolon discussing, and I watched this video and I think I clipped it at the time, discussing the ways that they could use Pierre Poilievre's willingness to appeal to the PPC supporters and the sort of same rhetoric that PPC folks are supportive of. They thought they could use that to push for more of the kinds of things that they want to see done in politics. So even though those guys aren't supporters of the Conservatives, they're supporters of the PPC, they saw an inroad there. And that to me is concerning because that means that people who I also watched interview a neo-Nazi, and I'm not mischaracterizing that. This guy, when you Google him, it literally says on Wikipedia, like the Google frame that comes up for you says neo-Nazi. Right. I watched a guy interview one of these dudes. He thinks that he can then turn around and affect the politics of someone who very well could be our next prime minister. So, whether he's right about that is one thing, but he had that conversation and it seemed like he really believed it. That's a bit of a red flag to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because you're right. It does sort of empower not just these groups, but look at the PPC for a second, right? Like, it empowers them. And I think people are too quick to dismiss the PPC, like, oh, well, they didn't win any seats. They only got X amount in the popular vote. They don't matter. But then their influence is weighed in different ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's, sorry, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you see it in the degree to which Conservatives feel as though they have to get back that tiny percentage that the PPC stole, and they're willing to say and do to get that percentage back.
Now, when people's material needs are met, like I'm thinking about stable housing, affordable groceries, healthcare, schooling, childcare, are we less prone to falling for disinformation, or does disinformation destabilize our trust in institutions that can cultivate the conditions to have those material needs met? I guess what I'm asking is, is it the chicken or the egg here? What comes first?
It's definitely... They're kind of, it's a bit of an Ouroboros situation, like the snake eating its own tail, because it definitely, when you don't have the things that you need to survive, that gets back into those big existential, scary questions where you want an answer. You want someone who's going to tell you that they're going to fix this. And there are people who might actually have answers that could fix this. Also a lot of people who will use that fear and the feeling of lack of stability to their benefit and will lie to you. And I mean, that's just like politics 101. You've seen this for forever. And it's like the thing you always hear, oh, politicians will promise everything and do like a quarter of it, not even. But there's certainly a feeling of anti-establishmentism, I guess.
Sure,
that takes, I'm inventing words here, but that takes root when the establishments are failing you, when you feel as though these systems that were supposed to be in place, supposed to keep people, and you're supposed to be able to access healthcare, you're supposed to have safe housing, you're paying to society, so you think that you're gonna be supported in that society to a degree. When that social contract isn't upheld, people get really angry for good reason. But the ways that anger takes root and the things that it fixates on, that's where conspiracism can really get a foothold. And I don't know, it's definitely something that then fuels more lack of safety because of all the things that we discussed in the TV segment that we did, talking about how people won't trust the democratic process. They have that anti-establishment that grabs a hold of them, and they might not trust the resolution that meant to political violence. that might turn into a January 6th, but maybe successful this time. So it's really something that fuels itself once it gets started.
It's interesting because, like, I'm a materialist in the sense that I think when you have a dissatisfied populace, they're almost more likely to look for that scapegoat that we see in disinformation, right? And that scapegoat can be the mainstream media or trans people or drug users or immigrants. And I feel like oftentimes our governments do a lot of symbolism, and I think that's great, but, you know, people need to put food on the table. They need services. They need access to housing. And I want to say that someone who is satisfied in their life is less prone to disinformation, but then I've personally seen people who are doing pretty well materially, but they fall into the rabbit holes of disinformation. So I also feel like it's not like one leads to the other. There's a whole myriad of factors, right?
Voters, you know, there's plenty of wealthy people who, I mean, a lot of the conspiracism and the conversations that we're seeing in these sort of more extreme communities have to do with not only disinformation about, you know, not being able to trust the system, but as you mentioned, you know, driving kind of hate against these vulnerable groups and implying that these immigrants are going to take your jobs or are going to take, you know, the reason you're having to pay so much in taxes is to deal with a climate crisis that isn't real and things like that, you know. So and those are things that can appeal to people even with a higher income bracket because they don't want to pay taxes or like if they feel as though their money isn't being well spent, that's all stuff that can appeal to them, right? And then there's also just like a genuine undercurrent of racism in a lot of this and transphobia that can't be discounted. I mean, I don't want to diminish it all to people who are feeling disaffected and who are maybe have various qualms or existential angst that isn't being properly channeled. It's also, some of it is genuine racism. I mean, I'm seeing conversations in these communities about especially immigrants from India that is just harrowing. Like it's the kind of racism that you see, like you'd see it in a TV show and think it's too cartoonish to be real, you know, like it's beyond. And I think that I also don't want to kind of discount the fact that people can be quite tribal and quite uncomfortable with things that are different or people who are different to them or they perceive as being different. And that can breed a lot of hostility. So I don't want to discount the degree to which that's a factor in people falling into these kind of rabbit holes.
Now, and I think you touched on this earlier when you were talking about prevention, but ultimately when we talk about disinformation, is this a personal responsibility issue or is this a structural systemic issue? And my worry with it being a systemic issue is that then it needs a systemic answer. And then those same people who buy into it are going to say, oh, see, here's the state censoring us or, you know, oppressing us or whatever. So how do you frame it? Is it a personal thing or is it something where larger institutions need to intervene?
Unfortunately, I do think a lot of it is systemic. But, you know, these hard, big issues often, unfortunately, have hard, big answers. But there's a few things that are kind of at play here. I mean, I think that one of the issues at hand is that people need to be taught to critically and to assess information properly. I think that that's something we need to make sure is being taught in schools. And, you know, that people know not to believe everything they read online and to, you know, what is a good source and what is not, like that super basic stuff, right? But also, there's other bigger things at play here. I mean, I alluded to this before, but with the ad tech industry, there is this monetary motivation for people to engage and disseminate disinformation, that can catch anyone. I mean, if there's enough of this out there, all someone has to do is click on the wrong meme or the wrong webpage or the wrong account, and they could be exposed to stuff that they could go, that, and then, you know, fall down a whole rabbit hole and you could lose them. And these kind of grifters, the perpetuators of this disinformation are often able to make money because there's no oversight and no regulation, or at least nowhere near a sufficient level of the ad tech industry. Like Google has a massive monopoly, which means that they don't really have to be held accountable for failing to enforce their own rules for where ad money goes, which they fail to enforce a lot. Like I have found ads for the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints on a porn website. Like that's probably not where they're intentionally putting their money, right? So, and that was because of Google. So there is an issue here where there's a lot of money being funneled into various websites that advertisers don't know their money is being funneled towards because of the way the ad tech system is set up and the opacity and lack of regulation. And this is an industry that I think within the next 2 years projected to be worth $1 trillion worldwide. So that is a lot of money and a lot of motivation to then engage in and disseminate disinformation. Because if you know how to game this system, because there's basically no rules and no one enforcing them, I mean, the sky's the limit, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I almost feel like, especially in Canada, I feel like we need more media criticism and well-founded media criticism. And I say that as someone, in the media, but I do think that sometimes, like I'm thinking about things like police accountability, right? Where a police press statement comes out and the media just takes it on face value. But there's not enough criticism of that. And I think, people should look to the media and say, hey, why aren't you looking at this in a more critical eye? And I understand that obviously newsrooms are shrinking and they have their own challenges. But I do feel like we need to cultivate a proper culture of media criticism, because the reality is that oftentimes the media doesn't get it right. And oftentimes I think people have fair questions, but they're not being reached with answers that really break it down for them. And I think we definitely saw that in COVID, where on the surface, people had fair questions about whether it was the vaccine or mandates or whatever. And there was almost like, you just have to do it for everyone, as opposed to really trying to explain to people why the gyms are closed or whatever. You know what I mean?
No, exactly. I think that there's going to be, with the pandemic specifically, there's going to be a lot of debriefing, and there should already be a lot going on. But like, there's things I regret. There's things that I wish I had characterized differently or worded differently, because sure. I don't think it necessarily was like the most accessible or the most helpful. Such an unprecedented situation and happening so fast. And then that comes back to the resources issue, right?
Yeah.
So it's like trying to do so much for shit pay. Sorry, I dropped it. But you're being underpaid, you're being overworked, and you're just doing your best while living in conditions as everyone else. And but then on the flip side of that is where that media criticism is so needed, because when these mistakes are being made, there needs to be, if they're going to catch them themselves, and we're not always, we need to call us out. And, I think that one thing that I've been really struck by since leaving my jobs in the sort of mainstream has been recognizing the ways in which media can really sort of manufacture, or I guess, the proportion of coverage that media outlets afford to a specific issue versus another can really shape national conversations, and the premises that are accepted versus the ones that are not can really shape a lot of policy and things like that, because politicians are reading these papers, and if all they see is like 15 conservative white male National Post columnists writing the exact same opinion about something, they might get the misguided idea that that's how everyone in the country feels.
Right.
And so it's like we need more media criticism and more of a diversity of voices and more money in media, so that more people can do it and do it better and do the kinds of deep dives we need, instead of just shoving out content. But we don't have that right now. And I think what scares me is not just that issue, but it's the degree to which I think a lot of people in positions of power, whether it be in the halls of parliament or within newsrooms and upper management, don't understand how in the current information environment, outrage can be manufactured and gamed and created. And so you can't respond to every scandal and take it at face value. Do you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
And that's sort of what we're seeing. We see that happen sometimes, and
it's easy to fall
concerning.
into. I mean, in defense of the media, like it is something that's easy to fall into.
I have too.
It's interesting because I think if we look at the history of moral panic, so even, outside of our era, moral panics have always had a partnership in media, right? Like media was the one that pushed the satanic panic of Dungeons and Dragons. They pushed kind of a false narrative about frivolous lawsuits when that woman spilt hot coffee on herself in McDonald's or whatever. And so, I do think that it's easy to say, oh, well, just focus on mainstream media. But I think there are issues within sort of news culture as well that need to be addressed if they are to be trusted by people who currently don't trust them.
Yeah, I think one thing I think about a lot is the ways in which newsrooms frame objectivity and bias versus lack of bias. And, I do really find that what newsrooms consider to be objective is objective from a sort of subjective standpoint of a, white, straight, cis, upper middle class, like middle-aged man. And that is sort of the baseline for what is objective. And then anything that deviates from that is bias. And you see this in there's all kinds of stories you hear. Like I have friends who have mentioned that, people are brought in to bring diversity into a newsroom. And they've told me, they're like, yeah, I knew I was that hired to actually say something about the coverage that I felt like was not actually objective and was actually a bit racist. Then they didn't want to hear me. So it's like, there are serious issues with, I think, what is considered objective versus what is considered subjective. And there's a lot of kind of prejudices built into that need to be interrogated for us to be able to serve the public better. So I don't know, I'm kind of just rambling, but I think that's a huge problem with our media right now is like, we need to interrogate that within ourselves and try to make sure that we're covering issues actually fairly, not just objectively, according to whatever that definition of objectivity is.
Going back to falling down into the disinformation rabbit hole, I feel like we all have someone in our life who is like a bit out there. And personally, I kind of cringe at the idea of like deprogramming loved ones or cutting them out of your life because they believe something crazy, but not hurting anyone. What can people do as individuals if we have people in our lives who repeatedly fall prey to disinformation?
Oh, it's such a hard one. I think to the extent that you can, because I don't want to sit here and like tell people to have conversations that are really, really difficult for them, especially like I'm like a white woman. So a lot of these conversations are easier for me to have because they're not invalidating like my very being and existence. But, to the degree that you're comfortable doing so, I think sitting down, listening and hearing what the heart of their grievance is and trying to understand like what it is that they actually fear that has sent them down this rabbit hole. And then maybe you can kind of build a baseline of empathy that can help you to reach them from a place that they will sense is a good place. Like one thing I think would surprise a lot of people is when I cover some of these conspiracy issues, I don't actually, for the most part, have a ton of, like, I have disdain for the grifters at the top,
Sure.
but I actually have a lot of sympathy for the people who fall in prey to them, because I think that they just want answers to really scary things. And I think that if you are able to kind of reach those people from that place and they sense that you're coming at them from a genuine place of, understanding that they are afraid or that they have genuine concerns that are valid, but they're just maybe going about them in the wrong way,
right,
I think you might have a better chance of reaching them. I could be wrong.
I think, well, no, I love that. I mean, I also think that you have to approach this from a place of empathy. And I think sometimes what you call it the left, just to be easy, but what the left sometimes does is just dismiss swaths of people. And I don't think that that's the most productive approach either, right? Like, I think individuals do have to be approached with some sense of empathy. So I absolutely agree. Last question, maybe the hardest one. Are we at the precipice? Are we at the precipice of civilization collapse? Because I feel like the COVID pandemic was a test run, and I think there's an argument that we failed that test run.
Like, maybe. There's a lot of really big things that are knocking at our door, like the climate crisis. I mean, Jesus, don't get me started on biodiversity, because that gets scary. Like, there's crises there. And then, we're just seeing income inequality, like, enter the stratosphere. And I don't know, it all does make me a little nervous about where we're all headed. But I feel like that's why we need to kind of look out for each other and not give in to that very human impulse that we've seen over history to retreat into like tribal, hyper partisan, hyper identitarian groups. Because if we're going to get through these huge existential challenges that are facing humanity right now, we have to do it together. And we have to not like fight each other in the way that we currently are, where we're demonizing anyone who we perceive to be other, or we're blaming the wrong people, or we're, taking easy outs and easy answers to big issues and big problems. We have to try to work together towards doing the difficult things that actually solve these big crises, because our future does depend on it. So
absolutely.
I don't know if that's hopeful or terrifying, but that's how I feel about it.
I think it's a great reminder for everyone, right? Even if you do think that you are not falling prey to disinformation, I think that's ultimately, along with empathy, of course, a great lesson to learn. Because if we're divided, how can we possibly solve these big existential crises? And there's certainly many of them on the horizon. And I think COVID, at least for a period, presented such a crisis as well. So I think that nailed it.
Oh, thanks.
It is, Rachel, it's honestly been a pleasure. I am so glad that we could connect. Keep up your great work. And whenever you're in Vancouver, drop by the studio and we'll have to do a sequel in studio.
Awesome. I would love that. Thank you so much for having me on. This was super fun.
Thank you. Folks, that was award-winning investigative journalist Rachel Gilmore. Find her on X, Instagram, TikTok. She's always pumping out incredible and accessible content. Of course, this is VANCOLOUR, and I'm Mo Amir, telling you that in a province where you can be anything, be colorful. Peace.